in Western Africa. And there were fossils of plants and animals in South America that were exactly the same as fossils found in Southern Africa. And so it's very unusual for animals and plants to be exactly the same when they're living thousands of miles apart. And so he realized he was looking at a jigsaw puzzle. You've all put together jigsaw puzzles. You use the shape of the piece and the picture. Well, he had the shape of the pieces right in front of him, and the picture was the fossils. And he realized that long ago, at the time of the dinosaurs, the world looked like this. All the land masses that we see scattered around the world today were all, at one time, smooshed together in a giant supercontinent called Pangaea, which means all the earth. And so those animals actually had come from the same place. And after they had turned into fossils, the continents drifted apart, carrying them thousands of miles away from each other. This is why we find dinosaur bones everywhere on the earth, on every continent, including Antarctica, which was tucked up here where it was warmer. After they started growing and they were going all over the world, then the continents began to break apart and drift apart, carrying the dinosaurs with them. But at the beginning, they were all together. Now let's look at some dinosaurs. Who knows the name of this very famous dinosaur? Yes, miss? Stegosaurus. Now, whenever a scientist discovers a new dinosaur, and we know more than 7,000 kinds so far, but whenever a new one is discovered, the scientist who studies it the most gets to name it. And he or she will use a Greek or Latin words to impress each other. But Stegosaurus was discovered 100 years ago. And Stegosaurus, the guy who found it, thought he was carrying his roof around his back. What do you think these big bony plates were for? Right, for protection. Like the spines of a porcupine, for instance. Yes. They stuck out in all directions, very discouraging for an animal to bite him on the back with these big bony plates sticking out in the way. Another idea is that he used them to stay warm and cool. After a cold night, Stegosaurus could face sideways to the rising sun, and all this would warm up in the sunlight, warming him up very quickly. And when it was too hot in the middle of the day, he could face so that the noonday sun hardly shone on them at all. But the wind would blow through them, cooling him off like a car's radiator. Now, he ate plants, and he had to eat constantly to feed this giant body through this little bitty head. Now, I drew myself in each one of these just to show you how big each dinosaur was compared to me. But there were no people at the time of the dinosaurs. 65 million years separate us from them. He ate the tough, hard plants and the gooey, squishy plants of the time, but they weren't the plants that you see around us today. Plants have changed as much as animals have changed. For instance, there were no flowers until the very end of the dinosaur age. And there were no grasses or grains of any kind until after the dinosaurs were gone. Those are the kinds of plants that give our world the way it looks today. But it wasn't like that back in the time of the dinosaurs. It was a very different looking place. Who knows the name of this very famous dinosaur? Yes, sir. Triceratops. You can remember this. 3 sides on a triangle, 3 wheels on a tricycle, and 3 horns on Triceratops. Tri means 3. Now, this guy was like a prehistoric buffalo. We think he ran in herds of hundreds across the open savannas of the prehistoric world. With these horns and this huge shield protecting his neck, there was very little that could ever pick on this guy once he was full grown. He ate plants all the time, and he had to eat basically constantly to feed this huge body. He had a parrot-like beak to bite off the tough plants of the savanna at the time. Now, in the oceans, there were enormous creatures. But a scientist will not call it a dinosaur unless it walked on land. You can Tylosaurus, snout lizard, because he had this big, long snout. He breathed air the way a porpoise or a whale does today. So he stayed near the surface. He had lungs. He was really a lizard that lived in the sea. He wasn't a fish. And he was the biggest thing in the sea at his time, and so he could eat anything he could catch. Now we find his bones in limestone, of course, because limestone is what forms at the bottom of the ocean where his bones would settle. But where do we find that limestone? In all places, a place called Kansas. Kansas, yes, Kansas, a state in the middle of our country, 1,000 miles from the Gulf of Mexico now, used to be the floor of a warm, shallow sea where many, many things lived. You see, as the continents drifted sideways across the earth, they buckled and they sagged, and sometimes they got low enough for the ocean water to flow in. And so for much of the time of the dinosaurs, the middle of our country was a warm, shallow sea. Now it's mostly the Rocky Mountains. So you go to the tops of the Rocky Mountains and you'll find shellfish fossils and fish fossils and Tylosaurus fossils. And all along the shores of this warm, shallow sea, we find dinosaur heaven. Lots and lots of dinosaurs lived in that area. It was a beautiful, lovely, easy place to live once long ago.
You mean like that it was
Now,
like
yes, now, in the skies, there were enormous creatures casting their shadow across the land. You've all heard of one called pterodactyl? Yes. Well, pterodactyl was only about this big. He was a lizard with wings. He was only about this big, about the size of a small hawk or a big eagle, or a big hawk and a small eagle. And he had a cousin called Quetzalcoatlus, named after the Aztec feathered serpent god. And Quetzalcoatlus was the largest flying animal ever. This creature was as big as a jet plane, and yet he only weighed about 200 pounds. He was a living kite with thin, hollow bones stretching skin across here. He could fly on the slightest breeze like a hang glider. And with this long beak, he could he hunted fish just the way long-beaked birds do today. Now, he's been in a movie. Anybody seen the Jurassic Park movies? Yes. Well, the rest of you will eventually see them. Now, wonderful movies, great movies, got some problems with science. For instance, Quetzalcoatlus comes swooping down and picking up that young paleontologist and carries him off. Ah! There's no way that could really happen. It's a 200-pound animal, can't pick up a 200-pound man and carry him off. Flying animals are working hard to keep themselves in the air. They can't pick up something their own weight and carry it off. But that's okay. Now let's get to the true giants. The sauropod families, the long necks. Here's me. There were so many different kinds of this model of animal. There was Brontosaurus, thunder lizard. There was Seismosaurus, the heaviest one, earthquake lizard, boom, boom. The longest one was Diplodocus, double backbone lizard. Longer than from that corner to the building to this corner, the longest animal we've ever found so far. And the tallest one was Brachiosaurus, arm lizard, with his forearms so tall. He was like an enormous giraffe. He was like 6 or 7 times taller than the tallest giraffe. He was 50 feet tall, which means he could look in the window of a 5-story building. You go out, you find a tall building, go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He could look in the 5th story window. He was 80 feet from nose to tail, and he weighed 80 tons. That's 160,000 pounds. That's 1,000 times heavier than me. This is a model of his thigh bone, from his hip to his knee. So this whole thing was 7 feet off the ground. His thigh bone went in here, right in there. This is about as big as an animal can get and have bones made out of bone. This is my thigh bone, just for comparison. Goes in there. And this guy, excuse me, sweetie, was so big and heavy, this was his footprint. All over the world, we find where dinosaurs walked in mud or sand. And their enormous weight squashed that mud or sand so deeply it left these big footprints. And if the conditions were just right, where the sun would bake that mud hard and new mud came in gently to cover it up, it would all turn to rock. And millions of years later, the rock on top would wear away and we find these footprints all over the world. This is a model after one found in Texas where there's dozens. You can follow the tracks of a giant dinosaur. And we even find interesting things like plant eaters walking along and meat eaters following behind and actually stepping in their footprints. We see a drama being acted out millions of years later. Even though Brachiosaurus was that tall, that big, and lived to be 100 years old to get this big, he came from an egg, only this big. Yes, dinosaur eggs are small compared to the full-grown animal. You see a cartoon or a movie of dinosaur eggs this big, there's no such thing. The eggs are heavy, they're full of water. Water is heavy. Eggshell is weak. There's no way an egg could be this big. It would just collapse under its own weight. In Argentina, in South America, we find a plain with dozens and dozens and dozens of big holes in the ground dug by dinosaurs and laid dozens of eggs in each one. And every once in a while we find a fossilized egg that's still whole. And so we pick through the hard stone that the whole thing is made out of, and inside, once in a while, we find an unborn dinosaur skeleton. So we know the exact kind of animal came from this kind of egg. But they weren't all giants. Some were tiny. This is life size of one of the smallest dinosaurs known, Compsognathus. He was in the Jurassic Park movies. Those nasty little ones running around, biting everybody. Little nasty little things. Now, Compsognathus brings me to a question I want to ask you. How many of you would like to see a living dinosaur? Oh, of course you would. Well, you did. You saw one today. Yes, you did, but you didn't pay any attention because you see them every single day. You can't miss them in Southern California. Because when you saw that bird, you saw the only living thing related to the dinosaurs. The only thing that comes down to us from the family of dinosaurs are the birds, whether it's a chicken or a hawk or an eagle or a hummingbird or a seagull or a sparrow. Birds are the only things left alive today related to the dinosaurs. They branched off of this kind of animal very early in the time of the dinosaurs, so there were fully fledged birds at the time of the dinosaurs. Archaeopteryx, you see in one of these books right here. Archaeopteryx was the halfway dinosaur, halfway bird kind of creature, and we find many, many more. It's just piling up, the evidence is piling up. Oh, and by the way, alligators and crocodiles have nothing to do with dinosaurs. They are not related to the dinosaurs in any way. They were around way before the dinosaurs, and they'll probably be around long after we're gone. Not related to the dinosaurs. But this kind of animal came in many different sizes. He came in small, medium, large, extra large, and we get to the superstars like Velociraptor. Yes, Michael Crichton, the man who wrote Jurassic Park, likes the sounds of words, and so he liked the sound Velociraptor. It's just a scary sounding word. It's like Darth Vader. Oh, okay. Problem with the movie is Velociraptor was really only 3 feet tall. And we now know he was covered with feathers. Very weird looking creature. Not the sports car version of T-Rex that's gobbling everybody up in the movie. And he's found in China, not Montana. Okay. The creature they're calling Velociraptor in the movie was actually a creature called